thank you very much. I'm very honored that you would all come on a rainy night from as far away as many of you have come. I hope that my voice holds out. I have one of those permanent colds that we get at this time of year. I'm going to begin with some work from the country between us, and then later conclude the reading with some new work. I'd like to begin with a poem about growing up in rural Michigan. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and our fathers worked in, my father was a tool and die maker, and most of our fathers worked in the industry surrounding the making of automobiles. We were, at that time, what was called greasers, which meant that the girls backcombed, ratted, or teased their hair until it was very high, and then we smoothed it over into a kind of motorcycle helmet shape, and we sprayed it with Aquanet hairspray so that it wouldn't move. And we wore white lipstick and black eye makeup, and our mothers thought, we thought we looked beautiful. Our mothers thought we looked embalmed. My closest friend was Victoria Champagne. That was her real name. And Vicki Champagne was more developed than I was, as we said in those days, which meant she had more boyfriends than I did. And I was her sidekick. And she was the person in my life who convinced me that it was possible to leave Michigan. And she had great plans for us. She liked to have boyfriends who were in the service. It was during the Vietnam War, because she thought they looked handsome in their uniforms, and also because they were really not very often around. So she never really had to, what we called then, do anything with them, which meant she could graduate from high school. And it was a very difficult time, as those who were there remember. And there was a depression in Detroit that began it also came here probably around the same time, but the factories began to close, and there wasn't any work. And Vicki Champagne married one of the boys and changed her name, as we did in those days, and moved away. And the family moved away. My family also moved away to other places where there was work. And so I lost her for 20 years. And this is a poem for her. There's some Quebecois in it, French-Canadian French, but you'll understand it from the context. As children together, under the sloped snow pinned all winter with Christmas lights, we waited for your father to whittle his soap cakes away, finish the whiskey. Your mother to carry her coffee from room to room, closing lights, cubed in the snow at our feet. Holding each other's coat sleeves, we slid down the roads in our tight black dresses, past crystal swamps and the death face of each dark house, over the golden ice of tobacco spit, the blue quiet of ponds, with town glowing behind the blind white hills and a scant snow ticking in the stars. You hummed Blanche comme la neige and spoke of Montreal, where a Quebecoise could sing, take any man's face to her unfastened blouse and wake to wine on the bedside table. I always believed this, Victoria, that there might be a way to get out. You were ashamed of that house, its round tins of surplus flour, chipped beef and white beans, relief checks, and winter trips that always ended in deer tied stiff to the car rack, the accordion breath of your uncles down from the north, and what you called the stupidity of the Michigan French. Your mirror grew ringed with photos of servicemen who had taken your breasts in their hands, the buttons of your blouses in their teeth, who had given you the silk tassels of their graduations, jackets embroidered with dragons from the Far East. You kept the corks that had fired from bottles over their beds, their letters with each city blackened envelopes of hair from their shaved heads. I am going to have it, you said. Flowers wrapped in paper from carts in Montreal. A plane lifting out of Detroit. A satin bed. A table cluttered with bottles of scent, so standing in a platter of ice outside a Catholic dance hall. You took their collars in your fine, chilled hands and lied your age to adulthood. I did not then have breasts of my own, nor any letters from boot camp. And when one of the men who had gathered around you took my mouth to his own, there was nothing other than the dance hall music rising to the arms of iced trees. I don't know where you are now, Victoria. They say you have children, a trailer in the snow near our town, and the husband you found as a girl returned from the Far East, broken, cursing holy blood at the table, where nightly a pile of white shavings is paid from the edge of his knife. If you read this poem, write to me. I have been to Paris since we parted. I found her last week for the first time in 20 years. I went back to my high school reunion. It wasn't expected that she would be there. No one else had heard from her in 20 years. It was very tearful, and we just hugged a lot, and we just spent the whole evening together. That's what we did. And we had a great talk about our lives. And when my husband met her, he said, "You're Victoria Champagne, but you're famous." And she looked at him and didn't know what he was talking about, and I explained that I had been looking for her in poetry readings. She said, "Poetry readings? I don't go to poetry readings." So I found her. I'm so happy. I can now say that, and this is the first reading I've ever been able to say that. I'm going to read a few poems from the first section of the book, On the Country Between Us. It's the section called In Salvador, 1978 to 1980. The section is dedicated to the memory of Monsignor Oscar Romero, who was the Archbishop of San Salvador until his assassination in March 1980. He was a saint. He was someone very like Gandhi. I realized he was a saint the last time I saw him. I had been working for him the last months I was there, working for the Socorro Jurídico, which was the church. Well, it was a human rights office, and I worked out of the Archbishop's human rights office and another human rights office. And I was supposed to leave the country. This was 2 weeks before he was killed, and I didn't want to leave. I had the idea that I could do a little bit more, and I had a little bit more time, and he said no. I knew that he was on the death list, so I wanted to persuade him to leave. And he said, "No, my place is with my people, and your place is with yours. Go home and talk about El Salvador at home. Help people to understand what we're up against here." There's an epigraph at the beginning of these poems. It's from the poetry of Antonio Machado. These lines are engraved on Machado's own tombstone. In Spanish, the lines are "Caminante, no hay camino, se hace camino al andar." In English, roughly, it's "Walker, there is no path. You make the path while you walk." I would like to read just a few poems from the time that was actually there. This one comes out of, it is written for a man who helped me inside a prison in Ahuachapan to document, to find evidence of a kind of torture that was going on in that prison that was necessary for the human rights agencies to know about it. it was a situation in which men were kept in small wooden boxes for up to a year, padlocked boxes, so that when they were taken out, the atrophy, because of the atrophy in their muscles, they were unable to move. Some of the men who were kept in the boxes were political prisoners, others were criminal prisoners. And the man who showed me the room inside the prison had taken a great risk to do this. The visitor. In Spanish, he whispers, "There is no time left." It is the sound of scythes arcing in wheat, the ache of some field song in Salvador. The wind along the prison, cautious as Francisco's hands on the inside, touching the walls as he walks. It is his wife's breath slipping into his cell each night while he imagines his hand to be hers. It is a small country. There is nothing one man will not do to another. The Colonel. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house. To scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner. Rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said, "Hello," on the terrace. The Colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The Colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. Because one is always forgotten. In memory of José Rodolfo Vieira, 1939 to 1981. When Vieira was buried, we knew it had come to an end. His coffin rocking into the ground like a boat or a cradle. "I could take my heart," he said, "and give it to a campesino, and he would cut it up and give it back. You can't eat heart in those 4 dark chambers where a man can be kept years." A boy soldier in the bone-hot sun works his knife to peel the face from a dead man and hang it from the branch of a tree, flowering with such faces. The heart is the toughest part of the body. Tenderness is in the hands. I would like to read a poem now in memory of a friend. Terence Dupre, I don't know if, well, Terence Dupre in 1976 published a book called The Survivor, An Anatomy of Life in the Death Camps. It was a study of survivor literature, the diaries and letters and novels and poetry that people who had survived the Holocaust wrote. He spent 5 years doing the research for it. In the midst of this research, he realized the enormity of the subject he had undertaken to write about. That enormity terrified him, and he realized that he felt so responsible then that he thought, I have to do this very, very well. It has to be everything, or I have to kill myself. And he decided to keep going and do it, and he did it. We became very close friends, and the friendship was very important in our lives. When I was in Salvador, now I can say, during the 2 years, he was the person in the United States who always knew where I was, and I sent all my documentation to him, and he kept it in a safe in upstate New York. And he taught at Colgate University, so he was up there in Hamilton. And he was living in a few rooms of a big house the university owned. It was a big drafty house, and it was all empty and had a lot of university storage in it, but he had made a little apartment in it. And that's what you'll hear about in this poem. I wrote this poem for him. It's called Ourselves or Nothing. And you'll hear things. You'll hear Theresienstadt. My father's family is from Czechoslovakia. Terezin was the village which was a transport camp. It was a holding facility. So that's in the poem. Salvador is in the poem. Vietnam is in the poem. When you hear Ao Dai, the Ao Dai were those dresses with the slits up the sides that the women in South Vietnam wore. And so it goes on and builds and builds. And this was a coda poem for me, the last poem of the book. Terence died 1 year ago this week. And so this is, I'm going to read for him because it's the anniversary now of the time that he died. Ourselves or Nothing, for Terence Dupre. After 7 years, and as the wine leaves and black trunks of maples wait beyond the window, I think of you north in the few lighted rooms of that ruined house. A candle in each open pane of breath, the absence of anyone, snow in a hurry to earth, my fingernails pressing half-moons into the sill as I watched you pouring 3, then 4 fingers of scotch over ice. The chill in your throat like a small blue bone, those years of your work on the Holocaust. You had to walk off the darkness. Miles of winter riverfront windows, the eyes in skulls along the river, gratings in the streets over jeweled human sewage, your breath hanging about your face like tobacco. I was with you even then. Your face the face of a clock as you swept through the memoirs of men and women who would not give up. In the short light of Decembers, you took suppers of whole white hens and pans of broth in a city of liquor bottles and light. Go after that which is lost, and all the mass graves of the centuries dead will open into your early waking hours. Belsen, Dachau, Saigon, Phnom Penh, and the one-meaning bridge of ravens, Sao Paulo, Armagh, Calcutta, Salvador, although these are not the same. You wrote, too, of Theresienstadt, that word that ran screaming into my girlhood, lifting its gray wool dress, the smoke in its violent plumes and feathers, the dark, wormy heart of the human desire to die. In Prague, Anna told me, there was bread, stubborn potatoes and fish, armies and the women who lie down with them, eggs perhaps, but never meat, but the dead. In Theresienstadt, she said, there was only the dying. Never bread, potatoes, fish, or women. They were all as yet girls then. Vast numbers of men and women died, you wrote, because they did not have time. The blessing of sheer time to recover. Your ration of time was smaller then. A tin spoon of winter, piano notes one at a time from the roof to the gutter. I am only imagining this as I had not yet entered your life, like the dark fact of a gun on your pillow, or Anna Akhmatova's Requiem and its final "I can," when the faceless woman before her asked, "Can you describe this?" I was not yet in your life when you turned the bullet toward the empty hole in yourself and whispered, "Finish this or die." But you lived, and what you wrote became the survivor, that act of contrition for despair. They turned to face the worst straight on, without sentiment or hope, simply to keep watch over life. Now as you sleep face down on your papers, the book pages turning of themselves in your invisible breath, I climb the stairs of that house, fragile with age and the dry fear of burning, and I touch the needle to music to wake you, the snow long past falling, something by Vivaldi or Brahms. I have come from our cacophonous ordinary lives, where I stood at the sink last summer scrubbing mud from potatoes and listening to the supper fish in the skillet, my eyes on the narrowed streets of rain through the window as I thought of the long war. That misted country turned to the moon's surface, gray and ringwormed with ridges of light, the women in their silk dye along the river, those flowers under fire rolled at night in the desperate arms of American men. Once I walked your rooms with my nightdress open, a cigarette from my lips to the darkness and back as you worked at times through to the morning. Always on my waking you were gone. The blue holes of your path through snow to the road, your face still haggard in the white mirror, the pained note where 10 times you had written the word recalcitrance, and once you will die and live under the name of someone who has actually died. I think of that night in a tropic hotel, the man who danced with a tray over his head and offered us free because we were socialistas. Not only that, he sang, but young and pretty. Later, as I lay on a cot in the heat, my friend was able to reach for the guns and load them, clicking in the moonlight with only the barest of sounds. He had heard them before me, moving among the palms. We were going to die there. I remember the moon notching its way through the palms and the calm sense that came for me at the end of my life. In that moment, the woman beside me became my sister. Her hand cupping her mouth, the blood that would later spill from her face if what we believed were the truth. Her blood would crawl black and belly down onto a balcony of hands and flashlights, cameras, flowers, propaganda. Her name was Renée. And without knowing her, you wrote, all things human take time, time which the damned never have, time for life to repair at least the worst of its wounds. It took time to wake, time for horror to incite revolt, time for the recovery of lucidity and will. In the late afternoons you returned, the long teeth shining from the eaves, a clink in the wood half burnt, and as you touched it alive, ici repose un déporté inconnu. In the mass graves, a woman's hand caged in the ribs of her child. A single stone in Spain beneath olives. In Germany, the silent windy fields. In the Soviet Union, where the snow is scarred with wire. In Salvador, where the blood will never soak into the ground. Everywhere and always go after that which is lost. There is a cyclone fence between ourselves and the slaughter, and behind it we hover in a calm, protected world, like netted fish, exactly like netted fish. It is either the beginning or the end of the world, and the choice is ourselves or nothing. When I first went to Europe, well, I stopped to see Terence on the way. That line, ici repose un déporté inconnu. Here lies the unknown deported. He said to me, well, you're going to Paris, so you should go. Everyone goes to Notre Dame Cathedral, so you'll go there. After you go there, go behind it. I'm not going to tell you what you're going to find, he said, but go behind it, and behind there, the cathedral, there's a key across the street, and you'll see a white stairwell. Go down the stairs. Try to go in the late afternoon, try to go alone. And then you'll see what I want you to see. Well, what I found at the bottom of the stairs was the memorial to the 200,000 French deportees, the people who were taken from France and died in the camps. There's a long tunnel underground there, and there's 200,000 tiny lights in the tunnel, on the side of the tunnel, one for each life. And there's a single light at the very end of the tunnel. And then there is this black slab that has ici repose un déporté inconnu there. And then there is, it's very austere and white, and there are bars on the window, and the Seine is going past, and it's very quiet. In the walls, there are poems, chiseled. Poems mostly from poets who were in the camps, whether they survived or not. And I noticed one that I thought was very beautiful. I didn't know French then. You know, I didn't have my French, but I read it in the wall, and I copied it onto a piece of paper without knowing what it meant. It was, Je rêve tellement fort de toi, tellement parle. I loved the language, so I copied it down. I kept it for 10 years, 12 years. I don't know how long it was, maybe that long. And I went home, and I never knew what the poem was. And years later, I came out of South Africa to have my baby in Europe. I was 8 months pregnant. I wound up in a little place in Paris, and there was one volume of poetry on the shelf, and I decided to spend my month of waiting for the baby to be born by translating. So I started to translate. I got to the last page. Je rêve tellement fort de toi, tellement. It's the poet, it's the poem, it's his poem, Robert Desnos. And so, coincidentally, I have just finished making the selected Desnos. It's the next thing I'm going to publish this year. And it all happened. It was very coincidental for me. I'm going to read you just the translation of that tiny little poem in the wall. I don't know exactly, maybe you will be able to feel this too. I don't know exactly who he's talking to here. He calls it the last poem. And it might be the people who died. He was interned. He finally died as the result of being in Buchenwald, but he was in small camps in France first. He was a resistance fighter, so that's why he was sent to the camps. The little poem, this is what's in the wall. I have dreamed so strongly of you. I have walked so much, talked so much I have loved your shadow, that there now remains for me nothing more of you. It remains for me to be a shadow among shadows, to be 100 times darker than the darkness, to be the shadow that will come and come again into your sunlit life. I'd like to read a little poem I don't want to make it this dark, but for some reason this is what it is, the new work. It's called In the Garden Shukeyen. A few years ago, well, maybe, 4 or 5 years ago, the Asian Writers' Congress was held in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they wanted to invite writers from other parts of the world. So they took the 6 nations, what they called the 6 nuclear nations, the 6 nations on Earth that had nuclear weapons, and they invited 2 poets from each of them. So Galway Cannell and I became the nuclear poets from the United States, and we went together there. And it was a very, very moving experience, as you can imagine. They spent a lot of time taking us to meet with Hibakusha. The Hibakusha are, of course, the survivors of the light, the Pika, the bomb. They were the people who were actually in Hiroshima or Nagasaki when the bomb was dropped, and for one reason or another were protected by distance or by what they were standing behind. Or most of them, almost all of them that you will meet today by going to Japan were children at the time, because the older ones have since died of leukemia and related diseases. What they generally comes under the heading for them of something called A-bomb disease. And but you speak with them, and they will tell you about their lives. They always begin exactly with the moment of the bomb. I started to notice this, and I would ask them questions about what their lives were like before the bomb, and they'd look at you as if it's a very peculiar thing to ask about, and they don't even know how to answer you. So they don't. Well, I spend a lot of time with them, and there was one woman in particular that I talked to a lot, and she had been a little girl. She had happened to have been in a garden, which is actually an ornamental garden in Hiroshima, which is called Shukeyen. It's very beautiful. There are these little lakes, and which have rounded bridges that reflect perfectly a circle in the water, and bonsai trees, and very pretty. She had been there, and because she had been near water and in greenery, she was spared. The people who were injured started flocking to this garden, however, because they wanted to jump into the water. She had never in all her life gone back to that garden, even though the garden was restored. And there were even the trees that survived, where they wrapped them up in burlap, give them a new skin so that they could keep living and things like that. But she had never gone there. And all of a sudden she looked and she said to us, "I can go back now. Do you want to come with me? We'll go back. I'll show you." So I went with her, and this is a poem that came out of that, and it's a dialogue. She's speaking in it, and to me, she says things as we walk along. In the garden of Shukeyen, by way of a vanished bridge, we cross this river as a cloud of lifted snow ascends the mountain. She has always been afraid to come here. It is the river she most remembers, the living and the dead, both crying for help. Of the dead, none had human shape. Beneath the propped branch of a matsu tree, she tells me, hundreds of thousands of people want to be able to describe the kindling that Danbara Higashirahocho district had become, the black fingernail of Mr. Yosho Hamada. On the opposite bank of the Ota, a weeping willow etches its memory of their faces into the river. Where light touches the face, the character for heart is written. We didn't have houses. We went into the fields with our neighbors, and people began to die. We were starving then. We tried to eat everything, even our blue passports. She strokes a burnt trunk of pine wrapped in straw. I was weak, and my skin hung from my fingertips like cloth. Do you think for a moment we were human beings to them? She comes to the stone angel holding sprays of chrysanthemum, not an angel, but a woman naked from the waist up. In the places where people have, with absolute and anonymous tenderness, gestured toward a consolation of the dead, she walked through the garden Shukeyen, calling the carp to the surface by clapping her hands. Do Americans think of us? So she began as we squatted over the toilets. If you wish this, I'll tell you, but nothing I say will be enough. We try to dress our burns with vegetable oil. Her hair is the white froth of rice rising up. Kettle sides her mind also. In the post-war years, she thought deeply about how to live. The common greeting, Dozo Hiroshiko, is please take care of me. All Hibakusha still alive were children then. A cemetery seen from the air is a child's city. I don't like this particular red flower because it reminds me of a woman's brain crushed under a roof. Perhaps my language is too precise and therefore difficult to understand. We have not, all these years, felt what you call happiness, but at times, with good fortune, we experience something close. Now I close with my new work, this new poem. It is an experiment. It's called The Angel of History. It's a meditation on the 20th century, but it has characters in it. I began writing it in April 1987. It's a meditation in which atrocities are viewed against a backdrop of ordinary common life, an apparently haphazard occurrence. It is written out of an acknowledgement of mortality that would make all lives contemporary. The work is in many voices, and these excerpts include those of Elie Wiesel, René Char, Gunther Eick, and Walter Benjamin. The voices also include that of a German Jewish woman with whom I was hospitalized in the Hôtel Dieu in Paris in 1986, and who spent the war years hiding from the Nazis in the French countryside. And that of my husband, Harry Madison, who spent 6 years photographing the overthrow of Somoza in Nicaragua and the war against the government of El Salvador. There is also the presence of my dear friend Margarita, who was the voice of Monsignor Romero's radio station YSAX in Salvador. The child in the poem is my baby son, Jean-Christophe. For clarity's sake, I should mention that the sequence I will read tonight ends with my evacuation from Beirut, Lebanon in the winter of 1984 on the American Navy's amphibious landing vessel, the USS Manitowoc. These excerpts include lines in French and also in German, but they'll be understood in the context, or at least that is my hope. This work for me has been like the process of writing subtitles for a film I'm not permitted to see, or like translating without an original text. In this work, I have felt at times like a courtroom stenographer attempting to record a symphony of voices, each more persistent than the other. They interrupt each other. They argue. One of them is always asking questions. I participate in this with them for 2 hours every day. The thing is very long now. The things I'm going to read you are little fragments. They are just little fragments to give you an idea of what it's going to be. And so I'll give you a few of those tonight in conclusion. Now you will hear Isieux. Isieux is a little town in France where there was, well, it was a little town on the Rhone, in the Rhone Valley, but it was the place where where 44 children were hidden until Klaus Barbie. Remember the Klaus Barbie trial last year? Well, until he discovered their whereabouts and ordered them deported. Isieux is there. Ellie is there. Ellie was my friend in the hospital. Hôtel Dieu is God's hotel. That's the translation of it. And that's where we were hospitalized in Paris. I thought it was really a funny, great name for a hospital, but that's where we were. And so that God's hotel is here. And okay. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing in from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such a violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. In the night-vaulted corridors of the Hôtel Dieu, an insomniac pushes her stretcher past an invisible row of pails. Bonjour, madame, je m'appelle Ellie. Trains, and behind them, laddered fields. This is Isieux during the war. Isieux and the neighboring village of Bragnay-Cordon. This is a farmhouse in Isieux. Itself a quiet place of stone houses over the Rhone Valley, where between Aprils 44 children were hidden, successfully for a year in view of the mountains, until the fields were black and snow fell all the night, over the little plaque which does not mention that they were Jewish children hidden April to April in Isieux near Bragnay-Cordon. Comme me vend l'écriture, comme un duvet d'oiseau sur ma vitre en hiver. In every window, a blank photograph of their internment. Within the house, the silence of God. 44 bedrolls, 44 metal cups, and the silence of God is God. In Pithiviers and Bonne-la-Ronde, in Les Milles, Les Tourelles, Moussac and Aubonne, the silence of God is God. The children were taken to Poland. The children were taken to Auschwitz in Poland, singing Vous n'aurez pas l'Alsace et la Lorraine. In a farmhouse still standing in Isieux, le silence des dieux et dieux. In the night corridors of the Hôtel Dieu, it is winter. If a city, then Hiroshima, Beirut. If an animal, hunger. If an absence, breath. If a grave, anonymous. If a century, this. Are the present 100 years a long time? But first see whether 100 years can be present. We lived in Saint Monique Ward over the main corridor, Ellie and myself, in the Hôtel Dieu on the Place du Parvis Notre-Dame. Below, the jonquils opened. Ellie was afflicted with scales again, tiny Ellie at the edge of her bed, peeling her arm skin away like opera gloves and weeping, cachet, 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 all during the war. Barn to barn in the haylight, field to cellar, winter took one of my sons and my own attempt to silence him the other. Le Dieu est un fou, a psychopath. Le Dieu est fou. It isn't normal for a mother to outlive her children. It isn't normal that my son should be dead. Paris. Oh, how I loathe this city because of its past. Then you wish to leave Paris? Mais oui. I wish to leave life, my dear. My parents deported. My aunts and uncles deported. My friends, all of them, deportees. I don't know what became of a single one, how they came to the end. My paper said I was Polish. When the money ran out, we ran. When the Nazis came, we ran. Cachet, cachet, cachet. The tubercular man offers his cigarette, and the snow falls patiently across the spring flowers. My life. Triste. Do you understand? This place, no good. France, no good. Germany, no good. Ni Sovietique, fascist. It is no good. Then why not leave Paris? With our bottle trees we walk. I am Jewish. Do you understand? Alone in a small room on the 3rd floor, always alone. To remain sane, I sing librettos to myself and German lullabies. Can you imagine? Mein Flügel ist zum Schwung bereit, ich kehrte gün zurück, denn blieb ich auch lebendige Zeit, ich hätte wenig Glück. my husband, was a soldier against the Nazis, French resistance. He wasn't killed in the war. He even returned to me. It was after the war he died. He died of cholera. And the world is worse now than it was then. Worse? Mais oui. In April, the lilacs come wrapped in Le Monde. A plane went down in Warsaw this afternoon. There was time to imagine it. A wedding dress hanging in a tool shed outside Warsaw. But when asked in what sense the world was worse, she answered, "Pardon, est-ce que je vous dérange? Je ne sais pas très bien m'expliquer en français. Hotel Dieu, some people say so. I say this God is insane. De présent, de absent, tout est toi, même le mal, tout est toi, l'homme surtout." The child took his first step alone, moving along the white corridor without help, but at night, nearly drowning in my own breath, Ellie lifting tissues of herself from herself. We had stopped telling each other the story, and each tried to wake first, fill her wash bowl first, and have the water closet to herself. Earlier and earlier we woke, first before the breakfast trays of coffee and hard roll, then before the blood carts came, then before daylight, wherein she seemed to have forgotten everything. Parlez-vous français? Est-ce que vous le parlez bien? Je ne sais pas très bien m'expliquer en français. Then my husband came with our child in his arms and stood outside Saint Monique. They would not permit the child near my bed, a tuberculosis wing in winter. "You go out then, in the hallway, yes. You have the right to see your child. Don't let anyone stop you. They are all fascists." One can't begin a poem without some scrap of error about oneself and the world. And the child, who had accompanied me to a discussion about language, crawled about on the floor. The petit bourgeois poet writes the petit bourgeois poem about the self and the feelings of the self because he has no self and he has no feelings. That could not have reached me, but her singing could have, her German singing in the Hotel Dieu on the Place du Parvis Notre-Dame and the silence of God is God could have reached me too. Here, in this book, I have found your illness. It is called St. Anthony's Fire. Why, I ask myself, what have I done? These are my surviving sons, Max and Jacques. Mama, maman, qu'est-ce que tu veux? Un peu d'eau. Words do not refer, you see, to objects in the world beyond words. One lives so badly because one always comes into the present unfinished, unable, distracted. And just now it was as if someone not alive were watching. So I asked if he'd suffered very much, and he said no. But when I came back from the border, something odd happened. It had been more than 70 days, and I weighed nothing. My bags were no heavier than usual, but I couldn't lift them. After a drink and some talk, I went for a rest. When I woke, my room was filled with vultures. They were hopping about the room, belching and vomiting flesh as you saw them at Puerto Diablo and El Playón, exactly as you saw them. As if someone not alive were watching, on the sill, the bureau, in the bath, and on my body, so fat with flesh they weren't able to fly. And when I turned, there was nothing, as when someone asks, is something wrong? In the window of my earlier life, it is often night and winter. A glass steamed with my own breath, and in rubbing it clear, I see only my own reflection. It was years before my face would become hers, yours, and hers the others, facing each other through days, pain, the prisoner's visiting window. Adjusting the light so as to see again, so as to commit memory to our features, as if it were possible to go on living for someone else. Only rarely did we truly feel the extent to which everything had changed. When she walked with me, for me, toward the National Palace, then inside, with me, to prevent my going alone, knowing each would give the other her own life. I live yours now, the one you might have lived in Paris, and your daughters are with me. We have festivals in memory of you, and nightmares in which you tell us it is never night when you die. 8 years later in France, I open your letter as if it had been sent from the time before we were parted. On sheer blue airmail paper in your cribbed hand, what has become of us? The factory work in Mexico has aged me, threaded my hair with tin, buried my eyes in my face, taken a few of my teeth, and emptied my body of its individual fruits. My children have grown and live separate from me in exile. I haven't seen them, nor the children they've had. The broken mountains have become neutral. I have in my possession his diary, a sack of the clothing they cut from his body, the photograph you took of us before the war, and I call it the war now. I no longer call it the struggle. Our house has fallen, and the debris prevents me from digging up what we buried behind it so many years ago. Please, when you write, describe again how I looked in the white dress that improbable morning when my life was soft. Here you live in an atelier beside Simone's overlooking the cemetery. Here in the spring your arms fill with lilacs wrapped in Le Monde. Here you are in exile and can't afford to buy a clock. Here at cafe tables you write letters to the disappeared, and worse, you mail them. Here you taste raskas, a fish you never will have tasted. Here you open your arms when the man who might have loved you comes. Surely, all art is the result of one's having been in danger, of having gone through an experience all the way to the end. As if someone not alive were watching, as the last helicopter lifted away from the deck of the Manitowoc and the ship turned engines on full toward Cyprus. Bonsoir, madame, je m'appelle Ellie. A colander of starlight, the sky in that part of the world. A wedding dress hanging in a tool shed outside Warsaw. Bonsoir, est-ce que je vous dérange? On the contrary, I'm happy to practice speaking. Then you aren't French. How fortunate for me. I couldn't have shared this room with a Frenchwoman. While the white phosphorus bombs plumed into the air like ostrich feathers of light, and I cursed you for remaining there without me, for tricking me into this evacuation. Parlez-vous français? Est-ce que vous le parlez bien? So beautiful, ma'am, from here, the sailor said, if you don't stop to think. And it went on like that all night. Questions in French, and it went on. Radiant white feathers until the coast of Cyprus, until Ellie slept. How can one confuse that much destruction with one woman's painful life? Est-ce que je vous dérange, she asked. Et pourquoi des questions? Because in French, there is no auxiliary verb corresponding to our English did, as in, did you wait for him to come back? And did he return from the war alive? Or did you decide on Cyprus to go on without him? You see, I told Madame about my life. I told her everything. And what did she say? America, it is no good. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Thank you.